I was adopted, and my brothers are real sons. When my father died, they laughed, "You're nobody. We will inherit everything." When I opened the handwritten letter, it said, "My son is the one who was there. Everything is for him." I've spent my entire life learning how to stay invisible. It's not that I didn't want to be seen, but when you grow up knowing you're not really one of them, you learn how to keep your head down, to avoid the words, the looks, the whispers. For as long as I can remember, my place in that house was always just a little to the side, a little removed. Richard was my father, but in so many ways I was never his son. I was 7 when Richard took me in, adopted me, more out of charity than love. A boy without a name, a history, a future. That was me. I had no family, no roots, no one to call my own. Richard was a hard man, a businessman, strict in his ways, unflinching in his discipline. But when he brought me into his home, I was given a roof over my head and food in my belly. For a time, I thought that was enough. But it wasn't. There were 2 others, 2 sons who were Richard's flesh and blood, Ethan and Kyle. The moment I walked into that house, I was already outnumbered. Their jokes were always there, sharp and biting, meant to remind me of what I would never be. They had their place, their bloodline, their heritage, and I was nothing more than the charity case. "You're just here because Dad had a soft spot," Ethan would say, a smirk pulling at the corners of his mouth. "You're not blood." It always stung, but I learned to keep it inside. I learned not to respond, not to react. I would pretend I didn't hear it, even when their words pierced through me like arrows. There was no point in standing up for myself. They never would have understood. They didn't want to. They didn't need to. Richard was a man of few words, but I knew he cared. He didn't need to say it. There were moments, small and fleeting, when he'd put his hand on my shoulder. A gesture, not of pity, but of recognition. A silent acknowledgement that I was there, that I mattered to him. It was rare, but it was enough. Those moments, I cherished them. They were mine, but they were always brief, because no matter how hard I tried, no matter how many times I showed up, no matter how much I worked to fit in, I was never truly part of the family. Ethan and Kyle were Richard's sons, and no matter how many years passed, no matter how many meals we shared, that would always be the truth. They never let me forget it. And so I stayed quiet in the background, waiting for moments when Richard's attention would drift my way. But those moments became fewer as time passed. The house was full of laughter and arguments, life carrying on around me like I was just a ghost, a silent observer. I accepted it, as painful as it was. I never complained. After all, who would listen? I wasn't part of their world. I never would be. Then a few weeks ago, everything changed. Richard died. The doctors had warned us about his heart, his lungs. He'd been sick for a while, and we all knew the end was coming. But no matter how many times you prepare yourself for loss, when it hits hard. You never expect it to feel so final, so cold. I remember the phone call. I was sitting at my kitchen table, staring at the empty chair across from me, when the words hit. My stomach dropped, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. The house was empty of him now. The man who had raised me, who had given me a life when I had none, was gone. The funeral was arranged quickly. Family trickled in, some from far away, others from just down the street. The house felt different now, quieter, emptier. And the moment the doors opened and they all walked in, I felt it again. That familiar sense of not quite belonging, not quite being part of the family. Ethan and Kyle were late, of course. It wasn't a surprise. They always seemed to be late to the important moments, the ones where they could make an entrance. They walked in with their wives, their kids, as if they were the ones carrying the legacy of Richard's name. They didn't acknowledge me, not once. They didn't have to. I didn't mind. I had learned long ago to let the silence settle around me. I watched them, standing tall, taking their places. And then, when the time came, when the lawyer stood in front of us and opened the will, I braced myself, because I knew what was coming. "We're the real heirs," Ethan said, interrupting the lawyer before he could even get a word out. He crossed his arms, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "There's nothing to read. Dad wouldn't leave anything to the stray." My heart froze, but I didn't show it. I had heard it all before. I had expected it. But Richard wasn't there to stop them this time, and I was left in the cold, just like I had always been. I said nothing. I kept my gaze steady, watching the lawyer, watching the others. I stayed silent, but I remembered something. Something that had happened just a week before Richard's death. A week before the heart attack, Richard had called me into his study. It was late after dinner, and I had thought he just wanted to talk about some business matters. But he didn't. He handed me a sealed envelope, his hand trembling just a little, like he was afraid of what it contained. "Don't open this until after I'm gone," he had said. His voice was steady, but his eyes were soft. "But when the time comes, you'll know what to do." I nodded, confused, unsure of what he meant. But I kept the envelope. I had kept it all this time. And now, as the lawyer started to read the will, I knew it was time. I excused myself, slipping out of the room before anyone could notice. My hands were shaking as I closed the door behind me. I found a quiet spot in the hallway, far enough away so that no one could see. And then I opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten, the ink slightly smudged, as if Richard had written it in a hurry. I held my breath as I read. "The man who was truly my son was the one who stood by me. Everything I own belongs to David." The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. The ink blurred as my eyes filled with tears. I had never expected this. Never imagined that Richard in his last days would do something like this for me. And then, beneath the note, there was something else. The final will. Notarized and signed, legally binding. Written just days before Richard passed. I sat there in silence, letting the words sink in. I wasn't just a boy who had been taken in. I wasn't the outsider anymore. Richard had made sure of that, and now the world was about to find out. The will was clear. Richard had chosen me. But as I stood there in the cold silence of the hallway, the weight of that moment crushed down on me. And it wasn't just the shock, it was the loneliness, the decades of silence that had built up like walls around my heart. For all the years I spent trying to prove I was worthy of being part of this family, Richard had done what no one else would. He had made me his son in the eyes of the law, in the eyes of the world. And yet, here I was, still standing alone. I folded the letter carefully, pressing it to my chest. There was no rush, no need to show anyone just yet. I knew what I had to do. I wasn't going to let them take this from me. The sound of voices drifted down the hallway, carrying the low hum of gossip. Ethan and Kyle had started speaking again, louder now, probably to drown out the discomfort of the moment. I could hear Kyle's voice clearly as he laughed, that same mocking tone that always made my skin crawl. "You really think Dad would leave him anything? You saw how he was, always so distant with him. He'd never consider that bastard as part of the family." Ethan joined in, the laughter dark, the words heavy with years of resentment. It was like they couldn't help themselves, couldn't stop reminding me that I wasn't theirs, that I never would be. And as always, I said nothing. I simply stood there, my heart racing, knowing the moment of reckoning was coming. The truth would be revealed soon enough. I stepped back into the room, where the lawyer was still standing. His eyes flicked to me, and I could see the unease in his gaze. But he didn't question it. He didn't dare. "Well, Mr. Smith," the lawyer said, his voice faltering for just a second as he adjusted his glasses, "it seems there has been a change. A new will was presented, one that I hadn't seen previously." He glanced down at the papers in his hands, then up at Ethan and Kyle. Their faces shifted almost imperceptibly, their grins faltering as their eyes locked with mine. It was only for a split second, but I could see the doubt, the confusion creeping in. "You're joking, right?" Ethan's voice was thick with disbelief. "There's no way Dad would leave him anything. You know what he thought of him. He'd never—" He trailed off, as if the thought of it was too much to comprehend. The lawyer didn't answer immediately, just cleared his throat and adjusted the papers once again. Then with a steady voice, he read aloud from the notarized will. "I, Richard Worthington, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my final will and testament. In the event of my passing, I bequeath everything I own without exception to my son, David Worthington. I declare that David is the man who has stood by me, who has shown me the strength, loyalty, and dedication that I value above all else. Everything I have, all my property, my assets, my estate, they belong to David, as he is the true son of my heart. The words echoed in the room, reverberating off the walls like the last sound of a thunderclap. Ethan and Kyle's faces turned pale, their jaws clenched tightly as they tried to process what they were hearing. The room had gone completely still, and the silence was suffocating. David. My name. I let it hang in the air, and I could see the realization dawning on them. Slowly, but inevitably. Richard had chosen me. He had made sure his final gesture was one of vindication. I wasn't just a stray anymore. What the hell is this? Kyle spat, his voice rising, though he quickly forced himself to lower it again, glancing at the others in the room. The lawyer didn't waver, his tone steady, unflinching. This is the final will, gentlemen, and it is legally binding. All your father's assets, his estate, everything, is to be transferred to David as per his wishes. I could feel their eyes on me, hot, angry. The resentment they had carried for so long was now a visible thing, burning in their gaze. It wasn't enough to destroy me, but I could see how much it tore at them. This was the moment they'd never imagined, the one where their position was taken from them without a fight, without them even seeing it coming. The power of it wasn't in the words, it was in the silence. I kept my eyes trained on the lawyer, my face calm, steady. I wasn't about to gloat, wasn't about to say anything I didn't need to. The moment was mine by right, and I would take it in silence, just as I had always learned to do. Ethan was the first to break, his face twisted, eyes narrowing as he tried to regain control. This is a joke. It has to be. Dad would never... Ethan. The lawyer's voice was firm now, authoritative. This is his final will. There is nothing more to be said. I could feel the tension building in the room, the anger simmering beneath the surface. But I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. I wasn't the outsider anymore. I wasn't the one who had been forgotten. And then it hit me. It wasn't just the wealth, the house, the inheritance that made this moment so powerful. It was the validation, the one thing I had never received. The acknowledgement that, in the end, Richard had seen me for who I truly was. Not just the adopted son, not just the charity case. I was his son, his real son. Ethan and Kyle were still fumbling with their words, still trying to twist the situation, trying to convince themselves this wasn't real. But they didn't matter anymore. Not in the way they once had. David Worthington was the name now, and no one would take that away. I didn't need to speak. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. All I had to do was be silent and let the truth unfold. And in that silence, they realized what they had lost. The lawyer shuffled the papers one last time, his hands trembling as he placed the will back into the folder. The room remained thick with tension, the air suffocating in its heaviness. Ethan and Kyle, their faces twisted with disbelief, stood motionless for a long moment. I could feel their eyes burning into my back, but I refused to turn. They were like two wolves who had just had their territory marked by a stronger, older predator. And in that moment, I was the one who had the power. They both knew it. The lawyer cleared his throat, his voice breaking the uncomfortable silence. As stated, there are no further provisions. The estate will be transferred according to Mr. Worthington's final wishes. He looked at each of us in turn. I trust we all understand the terms? Kyle's laughter broke free, high-pitched and strained. It sounded desperate, like he was trying to force normalcy into a moment that couldn't be salvaged. This is insane. There's no way. You really think this is what he wanted? He was sick, David. He didn't know what he was saying. His words trailed off as he realized how feeble they sounded. I didn't respond. There was no need. Kyle's panic was telling enough. Ethan remained silent, his face red with suppressed fury. It was the quiet ones you had to watch, the ones who didn't say much, who simmered with resentment until it all came to a head. I knew the type. I'd been living with one my entire life. You're really going to let this happen, Dad? Ethan finally spoke, his words barely more than a whisper. You always said blood meant everything. The bitterness in his tone was sharp. Is that it then? He's your son now? I didn't move, didn't flinch. The old arguments, the old wounds, they didn't matter anymore. Not now. Their accusations were like air to me, not worth inhaling. The room felt smaller, the air growing heavier with each passing second. I kept my eyes straight ahead, letting them stew in the discomfort. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me crack. I had spent a lifetime being the outsider. I had spent years in silence, bearing their cold looks and cruel words. Now their silent war had come to an end. After a while, Kyle muttered something under his breath, the words barely audible. He's not even one of us. He doesn't belong here. You don't belong here. His words cut, but only for a moment. I had long since stopped being bothered by the things they said. I had learned to swallow my pride, to let their venom slide off me like water off a stone. My mind drifted back to the past, to the long nights spent in that house. I'd always been the shadow in the background. Ethan and Kyle had their jokes, their games, and then there was me, always the one left behind, the one who didn't fit. But there were also moments when Richard had shown me kindness, when he had treated me like a son in ways that no one else had. Small gestures, small words that spoke louder than anything else. A glance here, a hand on the shoulder there. In the quiet moments, I had always felt it, his regard for me, his silent acknowledgement of what I had been to him. I remember one moment in particular, when I was around 12, and Ethan and Kyle had been especially cruel to me. Richard had been standing in the kitchen, reading the paper, when I walked past. He had stopped me with a glance, a small flicker of warmth in his eyes. David, he had said softly so no one else could hear, you've got a lot of heart. Don't let them make you forget that. I never forgot. Those few words kept me going through the years of rejection, of being the outsider. Richard may not have said it often, but he had always known. He had always seen the person I was, and for that I was grateful. Ethan and Kyle had never understood that. They had only seen me as a problem, as something they had to tolerate, something they had to push aside to make room for themselves. And now their world was crumbling. They were losing everything they thought was theirs. They couldn't take it. They couldn't bear to watch me stand there, so calm, so unbothered, when everything they had worked for was slipping through their fingers. The empire they thought they'd inherit, their place in the world. It was all being taken away by someone they had always seen as beneath them. And it hurt them. I could feel it. The raw, biting pain in their eyes. They weren't angry at me. They were angry at themselves. Angry that they had never been able to see what Richard had seen in me. Angry that they had wasted all these years hating me instead of seeing the truth. The lawyer looked at me, then at them, then back at me. There was a question in his eyes. He was waiting for me to speak, waiting for me to take control of the situation, to push them down further. But I didn't. Instead, I looked at Ethan and Kyle one last time. No words, no gloating. Just a quiet, steady gaze. They knew what I was thinking. They knew what had been done. I didn't need to say anything. I had already won. They were left in their frustration, in their confusion, with nothing left to say. And with that, I turned. I left the room. The lawyer began to pack up his things, but I didn't hear what else he said. I didn't need to. The inheritance had been passed on to the one who had stood by Richard all these years. Not by blood, but by something far stronger. I didn't need to rub it in their faces. I just needed to walk away. The drive home was a blur, the streets passing by in quick succession, my hands gripping the steering wheel, as though I could control the chaos in my head. My mind was elsewhere. It always was after moments like this, moments when something deep inside had shifted, and everything I had known was suddenly a little different, a little lighter. There was a strange sense of peace that came with the weight of it all, the weight of the will, the weight of years spent as the outsider, the weight of finally being seen. But it wasn't the victory I had imagined. I'd won, yes. But at what cost? The old house, the house I had grown up in, the house where I had learned to swallow my pain and hide my tears, loomed in the distance as I drove toward it. The place where Richard and I had shared quiet, unspoken moments. The place where I had learned that love wasn't always loud and brash, but could be quiet and enduring. I had always believed that the house held something that the world outside didn't. A sanctuary of sorts. Now it felt like a cage. The house was empty when I entered. The furniture still where it had been, the air thick with the weight of memories. It felt like a tomb, cold and silent, devoid of life. I walked through the room slowly, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The house hadn't changed in all these years, but I had. I stopped in front of Richard's old study, where he had spent countless hours working, the door slightly ajar. There inside were the remnants of his life. His desk covered in papers, his old leather chair worn with use, the place where he had built everything, his career, his reputation, his family. And now I was the one who stood here, the one who had been chosen. A sudden rush of emotion hit me, unexpected and fierce. The grief I had buried deep inside for so long began to rise, a choking wave of loss. Richard was gone, the man who had raised me, the man who had been my father in every way that mattered. He was gone. I sank into the chair, the familiar creak of the leather under me bringing a strange comfort. I closed my eyes, letting the tears come, but not loudly. I had learned to cry quietly, to mourn without making a sound. No one needed to hear it. The sudden realization hit me. I wasn't the boy anymore. I wasn't the outsider. I was the heir. I was the son. But did it matter? Did it really change anything? I had spent so many years wanting to belong, wanting to be seen, wanting to be loved. But now that I had it, now that it was all mine, I wasn't sure what to do with it. The wind outside picked up, the sound of it whistling through the trees, filtering in through the windows. The house felt even colder now, a silence that was heavier than before, as though even the walls themselves were mourning. A sudden knock at the door startled me. My heart raced, and I stood up quickly, wiping away the remnants of tears, hoping no one had seen. I didn't want to be vulnerable, not now, not when everything was in flux. I opened the door to find the lawyer standing there, his face as stoic as ever. He looked down at the papers in his hand. I thought you'd want to know, Mr. Worthington, he began, his voice tentative. There's something else. I raised an eyebrow, still too wrapped up in my thoughts to fully process what he was saying. What is it? I asked quietly, my voice steady but inwardly. My heart was thumping hard against my chest. The lawyer shifted on his feet before speaking again. It's about the estate. It's not all settled just yet. Ethan and Kyle, they've filed a challenge. I stood still. Of course they had. The last thing they would do was walk away quietly. Are you saying they're trying to fight this? I asked, my voice even, despite the sudden storm of emotions that crashed through me. Yes, he said simply. They claim the will is invalid. They argue that it was made under duress, that your father wasn't in a right state of mind. They're planning to contest it in court. A cold rage flickered inside me, but I forced it down. I see. I stepped back, the door still slightly ajar, as though inviting the world to intrude on my grief once again. I felt the heat of anger rising, but I knew better than to show it. I had learned to mask my feelings, to play the game with a calm face and a steady hand. The lawyer hesitated for a moment, clearly uncomfortable. I know this isn't what you expected, he said softly, but I wanted you to be prepared. The road ahead may not be as smooth as it seemed. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I had heard him. My mind was already somewhere else, already calculating the steps I'd need to take. They wanted a fight? Fine. I had always been good at letting them underestimate me. Now they would see just how wrong they were. But I wasn't going to rush into battle. Not yet. I had time. And this time, I wasn't going to let my silence be mistaken for weakness. I had learned patience, learned the art of waiting for the perfect moment, and that moment would come. Thank you, I said, closing the door softly behind me. The sound of it echoed in the silence of the house. I turned and walked back to Richard's study. I needed to think. I needed to plan. And above all, I needed to remember. What was it Richard had always said to me? Don't let them make you forget who you are. I wouldn't forget. Not now, not ever. Days passed, but the silence in the house felt louder than ever. The phone calls, the meetings, the constant emails. They all blurred together. Ethan and Kyle's challenge loomed over me like a shadow I couldn't shake off. They were relentless, convinced that they could undo everything. The truth didn't matter to them. All that mattered was taking back what they thought was theirs. I had long since stopped responding to their messages. The petty insults, the false pretenses, their feigned concern about the estate. I'd heard it all before. This time, though, I wasn't the boy who cowered in the corner. I wasn't the one who had to prove myself. I had the letter, I had the will, and I had Richard's quiet strength running through my veins. The days grew colder as autumn settled in. I stood in front of the fireplace, watching the flames crackle and dance. The house, once filled with life, now felt like an empty shell. My father's absence was so much more profound than I had ever imagined. His presence had been a constant, a steady force that had held everything together. And now that he was gone, the walls felt like they were closing in. But I couldn't afford to mourn forever. Not now. The lawyer had told me that the court hearing was set for next week. The brothers were gathering their witnesses, preparing their arguments. They'd hired a team of attorneys who were hungry for a fight, eager to make me out as the opportunistic outsider. But I didn't need to fight back with fury. I didn't need to shout or rage. This time, I would let the truth speak for itself. The day of the hearing arrived too quickly. I stood outside the courthouse, the weight of the papers in my briefcase pressing down on me. It wasn't just the will I carried. It was the legacy of my father, of everything we had built together, everything I had sacrificed to prove I belonged. I didn't look at Ethan and Kyle as they entered the courthouse. They were already smirking, whispering to their lawyer, as if they had already won. I couldn't help but feel a cold sense of pity for them. They still didn't get it. They never would. Inside, the courtroom was tense. The air was thick with anticipation as the judge called the proceedings to order. I sat quietly at the table, my hands resting in front of me, fingers lightly tapping the surface. Ethan and Kyle took their seats across from me, their faces full of smug confidence. They had no idea what was coming. The lawyer for the other side stood first, their voice booming in the silence of the courtroom. He painted a picture of me as a stranger, a man who had been a mere shadow in the family's life, a man who had never earned his place. They twisted the truth, tried to discredit Richard's final decision, claiming that his mind had been clouded by age, by his illness. They insisted that I wasn't truly his son, that the will was a mistake. I sat quietly, my gaze never wavering from the lawyer. He spoke with all the conviction of someone who knew they were trying to sell a lie, and that was when I finally spoke. "I'd like to present evidence," I said, my voice steady but firm. The judge turned to me, a slight nod of acknowledgement. "Please proceed," he said. I rose slowly from my seat, feeling the weight of the room on my shoulders. I pulled the envelope from my briefcase, the one that had sat with me in silence for days, the one that held everything I needed to prove that Richard had never doubted me. I stepped forward, handing the letter to the judge, my hands unshaken. The courtroom fell into silence as the judge read the letter aloud, his voice carrying the words that Richard had written so many years ago. "The man who was truly my son was the one who stood by me. Everything I own belongs to David." The room was still for a long moment. I felt Ethan and Kyle's gaze burning into me, their smirks slowly fading as the reality of the situation settled over them. The judge looked up from the letter, his eyes scanning the room. There was no drama in his expression, no rush to judgment, just the calm certainty of someone who had seen the truth in front of him. "The will stands, the judge said. "There will be no further contest. Richard Worthington's final wishes are clear. Everything, as per the will, belongs to David Worthington." I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply nodded, my gaze never leaving the floor. I had already won. There was nothing more to say. Ethan and Kyle's faces twisted in disbelief, their mouths opening and closing as if they were searching for words that wouldn't come. Their lawyers tried to protest, but it was all futile. They had lost. They had underestimated me, and they had underestimated Richard. I didn't look at them as I gathered my things, the weight of my father's legacy finally settling into place. I walked out of the courtroom, my steps steady and sure, my heart calm. The world outside seemed brighter somehow, the air fresher. It felt like I had finally exhaled, like the years of quiet torment had been lifted from my shoulders. I wasn't the boy anymore. I wasn't the outsider. I was his son, and that was enough.